Hello pals, today we're going to have a little chat about the books that shaped my reading journey from childhood right through to my late teens. And these stories have inspired and challenged and in many ways have left a really lasting impact on not only who I am as a reader, but also who I am as a person. So let's get right into it. So I have a few books on my shelves that I've kept from when I was a young child, and something that really used to frustrate me was that every time that I bought a book or was gifted a book, my mom used to write the date that it was bought or the date that I received it. But actually now in hindsight it's brilliant because I can actually tell when I had these books and when these books were impacting my life. With that said, the first book, and a book that I received on the 9th of November 1992 when I would have been 3 years old, we're talking The Enchanted Wood. And this one apparently is a fairy tale flap book by Gerald Hawksley, and I remember loving this. So we go through the Enchanted Wood and we have all of these different houses that we get an insight into. This one was my favourite because not only did it have one flap, it had two, and it's so tiny. And clearly that still brings me joy today. So then we move into 1993 when I would have been 4 years old, and we have this book which is After the Storm, and it's one of those Percy the Parkkeeper books written by Nick Butterworth. And this one I was obsessed with, and this one actually has had a lasting impact on me, and I will tell you why. So this story follows a number of creatures in the forest after a storm when all of their houses have been wrecked and ruined and blown down, and they all get together and they decide to build a big house for all of them to live in. So in the back of this book is this huge fold out poster. It's absolutely massive, so I'm not going to open it up, but I'll pop a little picture of it up here because I remember being able to find it online a few years ago. And this picture, to this day, this is my ideal house. Honestly, not joking, not being facetious here. I want to live in this treehouse, and I always felt that once I had my own home that I would get a print of this and put it up on the wall, because I feel like it has significantly impacted everything I've aspired toward for the entirety of my life. Then we're moving right into Christmas of 1994, and we have a nursery rhyme book, and it is loved to death. You can see all this tape here still holding it together, and this was illustrated by Eric Kincaid. And actually, if you can see the illustration on the front, it used to creep me out. And also this bird on the back, why was he so cranky? I absolutely was obsessed with this. It's just an illustrated book of nursery rhymes, and I think my cousin at the time also got a copy of this from Santa, which was bizarre. Santa must have known that we knew each other, I guess. And then into Christmas of 1995, and we have a little book of well-loved Christmas tales. So we have The Night Before Christmas, A Christmas Carol, The Little Fir Tree, and The Nutcracker. And again, this one was very well-loved. In fact, I think this one may have been well-loved by my childhood dog. Little bit of a chew on this and another few of the books, I believe, but I remember absolutely adoring this book, and to this day I could probably recite The Night Before Christmas. I keep going to say The Nightmare Before Christmas because that's so ingrained in my psyche now, but it's The Night Before Christmas. I particularly loved The Night Before Christmas. Why do I feel a little bit like crying going through these? They're so cute. Next up then I have a little set of 4 books, and there's no date on these, but I can only assume that I was reading these while I was very young, and those books are books by Beatrix Potter. So this is the original Beatrix Potter collection, and we have The Tale of Mrs. Tittlemouse, The Tale of Benjamin Bunny, The Tale of Mr. Jeremy Fisher, and The Tale of Mrs. Tiggywinkle. And The Tale of Mrs. Tiggywinkle was my absolute favourite. So she was a little hedgehog, and look at her in her little apron. And she's so cute. And I always thought, before I started getting tattoos, I always thought that my first ever tattoo would be a tattoo of Mrs. Tiggywinkle. That's still pending. We're gonna have to watch this space. But definitely Beatrix Potter gave me a real love for stories about nature, about animals. And to this day, I love animals. And I'm not talking dogs and cats and elephants. I'm talking, I love little field mice. I love little frogs. I love little rats. I think they're adorable. I love little spiders. I absolutely have such an appreciation for little creatures, and I feel like that was something that was instilled in me as a young child by my parents, but also by books like this one. Beatrix Potter was a writer and an illustrator. She was a natural scientist, I believe, and a conservationist, so she was really very much ahead of her time. She wrote about 60 books over her career, I believe, and she illustrated them as well, and she's the mind behind so many characters that we know and love today. But I will say that Mrs. Tiggywinkle for me was the epitome of a great story, a great character. I absolutely adored this book and just Beatrix Potter in general. And then next up we have some books, and this is around the time that I started to steal my brother's books, and one in particular that I really loved was the BFG by Roald Dahl. Like, this is such a lovely 90s edition of this book, and the date on it is his birthday in 1995, so he would have gotten this for his 7th birthday. I would have been 5. This story was about a young girl who was basically taken from her orphanage by the big friendly giant after she spots him on the street. I was obsessed with this book, with the idea of this giant putting dreams into people's rooms as they slept at night, and this really started a love for me of Roald Dahl. And another book then that I really loved of his was, incidentally, not Matilda, which you would expect, but Danny, the Champion of the World. So this book is about a young boy who lives with his father, and they're very poor, and they come up with this harebrained scheme, and I really loved this book. I loved their relationship, and I really liked, I think, how this book not necessarily romanticized poverty, but how they were able to make do and be happy with so little. And I am just going to say as a caveat that I do not agree with or accept or promote Roald Dahl's political views, we shall say. I know that nowadays he is quite the controversial character, and for good reason, and I don't condone his beliefs or his behaviours. And then next we have a series of books by Enid Blyton. So I remember having a storybook with Brer Bear and Brer Rabbit and a lot of other different stories by Enid Blyton, and I wasn't all that into them, but let me tell you, when my mother introduced me to the Secret Seven, I was all in. So I believe that there were about 15 full-length novels published in this series. I think they began to be published in around 1949, don't hold me to that. So essentially we follow a fictional group of child detectives. This is probably most likely where my love of mystery stories come from. There were 7 of them, and they had a lovely little dog, and I have previously mentioned a dog that chewed my Christmas book. Well, the dog in the Secret Seven was named Scamper, and my childhood dog, incidentally, then was named Scamper. So talk about obsessed, right? I loved these books, and I would be very curious now about reading them to see how they hold up nowadays, but I loved them, and I loved the idea of solving mysteries. I love this idea of groups that really create this sense of found family, and I think that this was probably very much the first time the trope of found family found me, and I have loved it ever since. Next up then, I'm going to speak about an author, and I came across this author because basically I spent so much of my childhood in my local library. I went there to do my homework, I went there just to hang out and read. I took part in so many of their events. They used to run these craft events, they used to run these creative writing events, like so many different things for children that were absolutely brilliant. The first author event that I ever went to was in my local library, and it was for the man, the legend, Eoin Colfer, but it was for his debut novel, Benny and Omar. This book is so well read. I couldn't tell you how many times I've read this book. So I got this book in May of 99, so I would have been 9 years old still, and I remember being enamored with this idea that real people wrote books, because I knew, obviously, I had this idea that people wrote books, but it felt like it wasn't something that normal people did, that people I knew did. It just felt like something completely outside of the realm of possibility. And I think this was the first time that it really struck me that anybody can write if they put the time and effort into it. Anybody can do it. I think that realization as a child, when you realize that you can do something that maybe you thought you couldn't, it's so powerful. I have treasured this book for my whole life, and at the time I really wanted to get my copy of this book signed, but I was too shy to approach Eoin Colfer. I was really shy as a child, I cannot tell you, and I didn't. And you know, when people talk about regrets and like things they would do differently, I always said, like kind of half jokingly, that I'd love to go back and have Eoin Colfer sign my book. And so Eoin Colfer took part in an author event in another library nearby this year, and I got him to sign my book for me. And he said to Aisling, all these years later, Eoin Colfer. And it was just such a full circle moment. I had a little cry about it on the drive home, like I can't tell you. He as an author had such a profound effect on me, just in terms of, as I've mentioned, this idea that we can write books, we can write short stories, we can write poems, we can write plays. And he also wrote Benny and Babe, which I loved as well. And of course, the infamous Artemis Fowl. And I believe my dog had a little gnaw on this, good man Scamper. And I absolutely loved him. Even still, I have such a huge respect for Eoin Colfer and for what he has done over the years. He was a primary school teacher, I believe, as well. So the impact that he has had on young people across the world, and now adults, is quite incredible. Next up then, I'm going to touch on a series of books that Google tells me were suitable for 8 to 12-year-olds, but I believe I was probably reading these a little bit younger than that, potentially. I'm talking about The Babysitter Club by Anne M. Martin. I think there might even have been a TV show made of this in the end. We follow Christy, Marianne, Claudia and Stacey, and this is a series of books about a group of friends that basically set up a babysitter club where people can ring one phone number and book a babysitter if they so desire. And I loved this idea, and it was told in first person narrative from different perspectives, so kind of one perspective per book if I remember correctly. And it dealt with all sorts of issues. I do remember in particular reading books that dealt with divorce, and another one that dealt with serious illness. It was definitely something that I loved, and I love this idea again of creating a community of something and being innovative, and I thought it was a really good idea. In hindsight now, if I had a child, would I allow an 11-year-old to babysit them? Absolutely not. I would be getting a babysitter for my 11-year-old babysitter as well. But I loved the idea of it at the time. I was obsessed with these books, and these were books that I definitely kept picking up from the library, so I never read them sequentially. I read whatever I could get my hands on, and I absolutely adored them. And then next we have a series of books that is still being recreated today in different formats. So I am talking about the Goosebumps books. So reader beware, you're in for a scare, and I certainly was. I was not suited to reading these books. I remember reading them, and basically they're a series of horror books written by R.L. Stine for children, and I'm sure they're probably not all that spooky, but I remember reading them at the time and being so creeped out, freaked out, scared, didn't want to sleep, didn't want to turn off the lights. I remember reading Stay Out of the Basement, and for some reason I got it into my head that cabbage was sentient and refused to eat cabbage for years after that. I remember reading Say Cheese and Die, and I think the first one I ever actually owned was The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. I remember my mum being such a huge fan of the spin-off TV show, and I used to pretend that I really loved them, and I used to sit in the sitting room with her and we'd watch them. And I still do this thing to this day, right? I've gotten much better with kind of scary things. I can watch scary things, I can read scary things, although I always maintain that books really get under your skin when they're scary. But Mom used to put these on, and I used to be terrified, and I would sit there and I would do this thing where I'm looking at the TV, right? But I actually look like here, so it looks kind of like I'm watching the TV and I can kind of see it out of the corner of my eye, or I used to just like intentionally blur my vision. So it allowed me to participate, but without actually having to look at the super scary thing, and it prevented quite a few jump scares. I still do this when I go to the cinema to a scary film. If I feel like I know a jump scare is coming, I will kind of like intentionally blur my own vision or just look to the side of the screen. So there's a little trick for you if you're super spooked by things. Next up then is a book that I read when I was far too young to be reading this book. And this book, of course, is Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. So this book was published in 1996 and won the Pulitzer Prize for autobiography in 1997. This book was everywhere. I remember my mom and her sisters and their friends were all talking about this book. It was in shop windows. It was massive at the time. I, as a voracious reader as a child, went to my mom and asked, can I read this book? Now, this book was published when I was 6 or 7, but I can't imagine that I was older than 9 or 10 when I actually read it. I remember my mum handing it to me and saying, you probably won't understand a lot of what's going on in the book, but you can give it a go if you like. And I remember reading it, and it gave me an education. This was a memoir written by Frank McCourt, who was born in Brooklyn. He moved back to Ireland when he was around 4 years old to Galway, I think, and his family were very poor and were also very significantly impacted by his dad's alcoholism. And the book is told from his perspective as a child. And I think that's probably what made the book accessible for me as a child at the time. Although that said, I definitely didn't get a lot of what happened. But I feel like this was the first book that really wrote about the difficulties and the horrors of real life, of everyday life that people have to live, will continue to have to live. And I still remember this book with great fondness. I did finish it. That was definitely the first book for adults that I ever read. Please don't call the authorities about my mum's parenting. I promise she was a really good parent. Next up then, and slightly more age appropriate, I'm going to talk about the Sweet Valley High series. So we follow Elizabeth and Jessica Wakefield. I was probably reading these when I was maybe 10, 11 or so. My mom used to look after a lot of my cousins, and they were all older, and they would come over and they would read these books, and I'd be curious about them, and then I'd want to read them. And I tell you, the Sweet Valley High books were much more interesting to somebody of that age than the Sweet Valley Kids or Sweet Valley Twins books. I remember them reading almost typically like a soap opera, which I absolutely ate up as like a young tween, trying to figure out just how the world worked and how to figure out my place within that. Still haven't figured that out, but you know, we're still working on it. It's a work in progress. Next up, we're back on the horror that I struggle to read. I'm talking the point horror books, and these are technically young adult, but I was probably reading these around the age of about 12 or so. And these are a series of young adult horror novels written by different authors. I believe R.L. Stine wrote one, and maybe that could potentially have been his platform that kind of kicked him off. Don't hold me to that. I remember reading really battered copies of these books from the library. Again, passing them around between my cousins and just reading them voraciously. I think ultimately these stories were probably very cheesy and didn't necessarily deal with many real life pressing issues, but they were just so readable, so easy to devour. And when I think back now in some funny way, I kind of conflate them with Stephen King. I don't think Stephen King actually wrote any of them, but I feel like they were that kind of readable. And I love Stephen King to this day, but I feel like point horror sort of put me in the direction of loving Stephen King books, and I don't even know how those relate, but in my head they do somehow. And then at 16 years of age, I remember reading another memoir, or what we thought was a memoir at the time. So to explain that, it was A Million Little Pieces by James Fry, and this was published and marketed as an autobiography or a memoir about a man who was in active addiction and alcoholism, and his journey from that through rehab, through like a 12-step program, or his struggles with that program. It was later revealed that he had greatly exaggerated or made up some of the story, but I didn't mind because it still was an incredible story, a very readable story. I really loved it, and I feel like this book gave me such a love for people who are down and out, people who are struggling, people who are not necessarily the forerunners in life. And I think this book is really the epitome of never let the truth get in the way of a good story. There was a sequel to this book called My Friend Leonard. I didn't love it as much. I remember often saying at the time that A Million Little Pieces was my favourite book of all time. I remember the book having a very distinct voice. It was written in a very specific, recognisable way. And as I've mentioned, My Friend Leonard, I didn't enjoy this as much. But there was a part in it, and I'm actually just going to read the quote because this is something I think about to this day. Leonard asks me if there's anything I need to know before he dies. I think about it for a minute, turn to him, say, "What's the meaning of life, Leonard?" He laughs, says, "That's an easy one, my son. It's whatever you want it to be." That's pretty appropriate from my perspective anyway. I feel like we don't necessarily have to have meaning, we create that for ourselves. And sometimes when I'm feeling a bit lost and start to wonder what the meaning of all this is, I think, yeah, it's absolutely whatever I want it to be. And then last but not least is a book that I read a little bit after reading A Million Little Pieces, and it was very influential to me as well. I ended up loving this author and reading so many of his books. And the book I'm talking about is Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. So this is very much a book with a cult following. There was a film made by David Fincher of this book, which absolutely sort of lifted the prestige of the book. So this novel was first published in 1996 and was Chuck Palahniuk's debut novel. We follow our unnamed protagonist and he's struggling a bit. He has severe insomnia and is really just not coping very well. He goes to the doctor and the doctor tells him that actually insomnia isn't really real struggle, and this man, who is not the best character, shall we say, he finds relief by impersonating a seriously ill person and goes to support groups, and in that he finds a sense of community and he meets the enigmatic Tyler Durden. They establish an underground fighting club as a form of radicalized psychotherapy essentially, and this book is a bit wild and it's very much the epitome of a book with an unreliable narrator. But I was hooked, friends. I was absolutely hooked. I think up to this point I had never really read that many books about characters that were absolutely despicable. You know, our protagonists are supposed to be likable, or so I thought, and this book really sort of shifted my idea of what a story could be, of what a protagonist could be. And I devoured so many of this author's books. They're all quite a bit strange, messed up, and I loved it. I ate it up. I felt like there was no author out there at the time writing like this man, and I read so many of his books, but I think Fight Club definitely had the most significant impact for me. I also remember loving a book named Rant that was written, I believe, almost like a screenplay, and I absolutely adored that one as well. But for me, Fight Club was up there as a book that really impacted and shaped me as a reader. And so that is it, pals. Thank you so much for joining me on this trip down memory lane. Let me know in the comments what books you would say really shaped you as a reader or even as a person. I'd love to know. I'd love to have a chat with you about it. If you want to see more from me, don't forget to subscribe. And otherwise, pals, I'll talk to you next week in another video. Thanks so much for watching and take care. Bye bye.